a webinar on corruption hosted by the University of the Free State this week. The head of the NPA's investigating directorate, Advocate Hermoine Cronje, said the specialized skills needed to fight South Africa's corruption pandemic are lacking. Another panelist, former High Court Justice Judge Dennis Davis, argued for a bigger role for the South African Revenue Service in fighting corruption. Now, Professor John Mubangizi is Dean of the University of the Free State. He joins us now to share some of his views on the matter. Prof, it's great to have you with us this morning on the show. I mean, one thing that stood out for me in that webinar yesterday, and it's an issue that we've discussed for some time in the country now, is the lack of specialized skills to get to the bottom of this corruption pandemic in our country.
Good morning, Michelle, and good morning to Newsroom Africa viewers, and thank you for having me on your show. Michelle, I don't quite agree, actually, because, prosecuting corruption is not rocket science. So South Africa does actually not lack the critical skills for successfully prosecuting corruption. I think what lacks is proper deployment of those skills. There are sufficient academic and professional programs in our institutions that offer those skills. However, if people qualify and are not deployed in the right positions, then it appears as if the country lacks the relevant skills.
And what about issues like, if we talk about specialized commercial crimes, let's call them those. The Steinhoff saga comes to mind. It was billed as accounting irregularities. We know that it's a lot more than just accounting irregularities. When we're talking about investigating that kind of financial crimes, let's say, on that score, what do you reckon?
Well, obviously there are challenges. These are professional skills that are required. But I still insist, and I think that if people were deployed in the right places with the right training, they would be able to do the job. Yeah. So it's not as if we don't have the skills, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago. It's just that those skills are not deployed in the right places, and we are not deploying the right people in the right positions. So if we were doing that, maybe corruption would be less of a problem. Yeah. I mean, prosecuting corruption would be less of a problem.
Prof, what do you make of the discussion around setting up a specified corruption court in the country?
Michelle, there are those who believe that we need a specialized corruption court. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them. Personally, I think that the South African court system is robust enough and perfectly capable of handling corruption prosecutions. So the problem is not the courts. I think the problem is everything else besides the courts. The investigations, the arrests, the prosecutions, and all those other processes. I have no qualm or no problems with the way the courts handle corruption cases. I think we all know that among the three arms of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary has been a beacon of hope in our democracy. So it's not the court system that is a problem. It is everything else besides the courts, including investigations, arrests, prosecutions, and so on.
Investigations, arrests, prosecutions, and perhaps, if we talk about this lack of, there's certainly a perceived lack of action being taken against corruption, both in arresting those responsible as well as recouping the money. Where does political will fit into that discussion?
Well, I have always argued that the political leadership and the political will is obviously a problem. I mean, you need to go no further than the State Capture Commission to see how the political leadership of this country are largely responsible for the endemic corruption. Some viewers will probably remember a former national spokesperson of the African National Congress who once stated that I did not struggle to be poor. What does that mean? How a citizen is supposed to interpret that? There is a view that many of our current leaders are living testimony to that statement. And therefore, the political will is lacking. And of course, there is also the question accountability. But maybe that's a different issue.
I mean, the money is lost to corruption. Some estimates putting it, I mean, the numbers are shocking whichever way you look at it. They differ somewhat depending on where you're looking, but exceeding, many would say, R1 trillion in terms of the money lost to the South African fiscus to corruption, Prof. A Chapter 9 institution, perhaps a good proposal when we want to talk about recouping some of that money?
Michelle, what we need is not an institution to merely recoup the financial losses sustained through corruption. I think what we need is something bigger than that. We need an independent, dedicated, permanent anti-corruption agency or commission. And that's an argument I've been making for a few years now. So the agencies we have, as you know, include the Hawks, the NPA, the Special Investigative Unit. But these agencies lack the required independence of an anti-corruption agency. So what we need is an anti-corruption commission or agency along the lines of, for example, Hong Kong's Independent Commission Against Corruption, which has been hailed as a powerful anti-corruption enforcement body and is largely responsible for the reduction of corruption in that state. There are many other countries that have such commissions or such institutions. I think, in my view, what South Africa needs is such a body, a Chapter 9 institution that has independence and powers to deal with corruption as many other countries have done.
I mean, one of the threads certainly that ran through that webinar that was hosted by your university, Prof, is this issue around a moral authority in the country. You know, South Africans very disheartened by the rate at which these investigations take place, the rate at which prosecutions are taking place, and our inability to recoup the money. Given all of the challenges that you've just expressed now, given what we now know is needed to combat corruption and to do so successfully, what's your reading of the next few years in South Africa? Perhaps you should tell us how you think it should look in terms of our dealing with this corruption pandemic.
Well, Michelle, I think one could say there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think the State Capture Commission has shown that we can deal with corruption, but there are a number of things that would need to do that. So, but I also think that fighting corruption is everyone's responsibility. It is a collective responsibility in which citizens have to work in partnership with government to eradicate the scourge. At the very least, the people must rise up and say, enough is enough. You remember the words of Edmund Burke, who once said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And of course, there are also those who say that the country is as corrupt as its citizens allow it to be. So we all have a role to play. But one could, reasonably say that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think if certain things are done, we could be able to deal with this endemic corruption in the country. I
suppose, Prof, one of the things that we will be keeping a close eye on as we talk about light at the end of the tunnel, so much hinging on the work of the state capture inquiry. When we talk about action being taken against corruption, we mention, that at least the state capture inquiry is doing important work. But so much hinges on what happens once the inquiry does finalize its report.
Precisely, Michelle. I think, in my view, so far, the State Capture Commission has done a wonderful job, and it has been meticulous. It has, it has a lot of evidence. Now, we all await with bated breath the release of the report. It will be a voluminous report. There is a lot of information that Justice Zondo has gathered. But as you have correctly mentioned, what is important is what happens after that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, I suspect that the recommendations will be straightforward, they will be clear, and what happens is how they are implemented. That will make or break the process.
Prof. John Mubangizi, Prof. John Mubangizi, thank you very much for your time this morning. This incredibly important discussion around corruption, that webinar hosted by the University of the Free State yesterday. Prof. Mubangizi is the Dean in the Faculty of Law at the university.